Good evening to you. Welcome to From the South. Coming up, an update on the impeachment process of President Rousseff, and the famous Peruvian writer named in the Panama Papers pledges his support for President Mauricio Macri. These are our headlines. My name is Reagan Des Vignes. Thank you for being here with us. First up, Brazil's impeachment commission has presented its report to the Senate suggesting the impeachment of President Rousseff. Now the Senate has to vote on whether or not to follow the commission's recommendations. The vote is expected on Friday before the issue goes to the Senate floor. In case the impeachment is approved, President Rousseff will be suspended for 180 days, during which time Vice President Michel Temer will lead Brazil. Rousseff, on her side, has responded to the Attorney General, who has opened up a probe against her for alleged obstruction of justice due to a leaked phone call.
Whoever leaked this piece of information has shady and inconfessable interests. I will request from the Brazilian General Advocate to ask the Supreme Court to investigate these leaks.
And the Brazilian government has presented the Harvest Plan 2016-2017, for which it will allocate nearly $60 billion in terms of loans for the farmers. Farmers have suffered particularly this year with record droughts due to the El Niño phenomenon. The plan seeks to help boost production and one of the country's worst economic crises. The grandmothers of Playa de Mayo have brought 4 former Air Force members to justice for crimes committed during the military dictatorship. The 4 men are believed to have been involved in the abduction of the daughter and son-in-law of Rosa, who is the vice president of the human rights organization. At the time of the kidnapping, Rosenblatt's daughter was 8 months pregnant, and it's believed that her baby was given to a wealthy family, which was a common practice during the dictatorship. One of the men faces charges. Omar Gravina was part of the governing military junta. Argentinian President Mauricio Macri met with renowned Peruvian writer Vargas, Llosa, in the presidential palace in Buenos Aires. The acclaimed author has been politically engaged over the past decade, as he's been openly critical of former President Cristina Fernandez. The right-wing novelist praised the Macri administration just a day after Argentina reached its highest inflation rate in 14 years. Critics pointed out that both Macri and Vargas Llosa have been named in the Panama Papers. Taxi drivers in Buenos Aires have staged a new protest after reports that the Uber transportation service has been operating despite a ban imposed by the city's government. The drivers' union has repeatedly complained about the illegal conditions in which Uber operates. Uber has been accused of not paying Social Security and of not paying fees to operate in the transportation sector. After the Honduran government issued a statement highlighting new developments in the investigations on the murder of indigenous leader Berta Cáceres, Chileans protested outside the Honduran embassy. Dozens of environmental and human rights activists demanded justice for Cáceres and criticized the inefficiency of the Honduran authorities, which still have not made significant breakthroughs months after the leader's murder. Venezuela's National Electoral Commission has begun the verification of over 1 million signatures presented by the right-wing opposition to launch a recall referendum against President Nicolás Maduro. The process is the first step towards the referendum. The electoral body anticipated that it would have the results of the verification process by Monday. It was 10 years ago that a police operation ordered by former Mexico State Governor, now Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto, left hundreds of residents from the rural town of San Salvador Atenco arrested. Dozens seriously injured, 27 women raped and 2 killed. For over 15 years, the community has protested against government and private company attempts to urbanize their farmlands with the aim of installing mega projects. Our correspondent Clayton Khan has more.
For many in San Salvador Atenco, the wounds inflicted from the violent police operation 10 years ago remain open. For Gregorio Pacheco, the violent night of May 3, 2006 left him scarred physically and mentally.
They entered many homes and didn't care if there were children and women. They destroyed everything and hauled many of us away.
For more than 15 years, community members of San Salvador Atenco have resisted private public infrastructure projects. Now in 2014, Mexico's President Enrique Peña Nieto announced plans for a new international airport in the area that the government affirms will not affect the lands of Atenco.
The injustice that they want to impose on these lands is based on untruthful arguments and information that confuses public opinion, and they seek to isolate those resistant communities in that they are seeking to defend their lands from this mega project.
For many of the farm workers in Atenco, defending their lands goes beyond just defending their economic interests to defending their customs and traditions passed on for generations.
Nuevamente el gobierno se impone no solo con los poderes económicos.
Again, the government is imposing not just with economic powers, but also here in the community. They want to do away with our uses and customs. That is why they've called upon the elderly, so that with their wisdom, they can help us recuperate our traditions.
Recuperar los usos y costumbres de
Meanwhile, as initial construction begins for the airport and lands adjacent to Atenco, a recent state law was approved that will grant the authorities the free use of deadly force when protests are deemed illegal or dangerous. Rights defenders argue that it's a means to legally halt social protests against mega projects.
The state government sees the necessity to satisfy the private companies that it represents and creates this law that legalizes the possible act of repression and human rights violations.
Activists and community members from Atenco say for the rest of the month of May, they will carry out protests and actions to not just commemorate the 10 years since the police repression, but also to further protest mega projects that threaten their lands. Clayton Can, teleSur's, San Salvador Atenco, Mexico.
Caribbean and Central American representatives are meeting in Washington for the U.S. Caribbean Central American Energy Summit. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden greeted the regional leaders to initiate the event. Representatives will discuss ways in which they can lower the cost of energy. According to the U.S. government, Central America and the Caribbean pay some of the highest rates for electricity. Russia has agreed to extend a ceasefire in Syria to the city of Aleppo and the Aleppo province. The ceasefire came into effect just after midnight in Damascus. According to the U.S. State Department, there's been an overall decrease in violence in the area, but there has been some fighting in some areas. According to a Syrian monitoring group, hundreds of people have been killed in the past 10 days. Earlier today, the Arab League held an emergency meeting condemning the targeting of hospitals, schools and homes in Syria. During the meeting, the Secretary General said that the persons responsible for the violence should be brought to justice. However, the regional body did not refer to the U.S. bombing of hospitals in Afghanistan or the bombing of hospitals by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. Now we turn you over to our correspondent in Syria.
The internal opposition factions, which don't have an invitation to participate in the Geneva peace talks, announced today the formation of a unified movement under the name of the National Opposition Bloc, stressing the importance of the unity of the Syrians in the fight against terrorism in all its forms.
We call for the categorical rejection of terrorism, whatever its shape or form, and of the Takfiri obscurantist terrorism, and we call them to fight them and to drain their cultural and social and economic resources.
The main objective of the formation of this bloc, according to its founders, is to unite as many as possible of the internal parties under one banner, in order to have a greater representation in the ongoing negotiations, which they seek to be involved in.
We are not against anyone. We are open to anyone who wants to join us, to anyone who conforms with our goals and our visions, and we emphasize that our hands are open to all. We will have a committee to communicate with all the forces that are inside Syria and even some opponents outside Syria.
Away from the conferences and speeches, Syrians continue feeling the streets of life in a clear message about their determination to bring life back to their country from the wreckage of war. Hazem Abdullah, Syria.
The European Commission has proposed a high fee for countries not willing to shelter refugees. The new rules would require that EU member countries pay over $280,000 for each asylum seeker they refuse. The body also gave the green light for visa-free travel for Turkey and Kosovo. Now the rules have to be approved by the bloc's member governments and by the European Parliament in order to be implemented. After pressure from his own party, British Prime Minister David Cameron says the UK will take in more unaccompanied Syrian refugee children from Europe. Children registered before March 20th will be eligible for resettlement. Cameron said the retrospective nature of the scheme would avoid creating a perverse incentive for families to entrust their children to human traffickers.
Conservative right across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister in congratulating Leicester City on their amazing achievement. Anti-Semitism has no place in our society whatsoever, and we all have a duty to oppose it. Labour is... Mr. Speaker.
Because the truth is this: he may be a friend of the terrorist group Hamas, but...
Bernie Sanders pulled off a surprise win in Indiana last night in the Democratic primary, while on the Republican side, Donald Trump won by a landslide, causing Ted Cruz and John Kasich to both drop out of the Republican race. A region wildfire that broke out on Sunday in Alberta, Canada, has forced over 80,000 residents to evacuate the area. No injuries have been reported, however 1,600 buildings have been damaged by the blaze. Fire officials said the fire is over 29 miles and is being tackled by 100 firefighters. Fears of a new attack by Israel against the Gaza Strip are looming. teleSur's Noha Razin has more on this story.
As the Palestinian Third Intifada, the Palestinian uprising enters its 7th month in a row, Palestinian people continue carrying attacks against Israeli settlers and Israeli forces in the West Bank. Today, Palestinian medical sources reported that one Palestinian was shot dead after he attacked and injured 3 Israeli settlers in the West Bank. This incident comes after several days of calmness in the West Bank. Here in the Gaza Strip, the situation is calm and peaceful. However, the Israeli naval forces continue violating the agreed ceasefire and do shoot on Palestinian fishermen off the coast of Gaza City.
Hundreds of journalists protested in Cairo, Egypt, demanding the dismissal of the country's interior minister. They chanted that members of the ministry are thugs. In this, the latest of demonstrations against the government of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Riot police closed streets, which led to the journalist union's headquarters, while a tense standoff with police developed outside the building. A fight broke out in the South African parliament after security officers were ordered to forcibly remove opposition MPs from the chamber. Members of the left-wing Economic Freedom Fighters Party were expelled for heckling President Jacob Zuma. It was Zuma's first appearance in parliament since 2 court rulings against him over corruption charges, which have sparked outrage amongst the population. The governments of Nigeria and Cameroon say they will remain committed in the fight against Islamist militant group Boko Haram. The members of the group have sworn allegiance to the Islamic State group. Boko Haram's 6-year campaign to set up an Islamic emirate in the region has displaced more than 2 million people and killed thousands more. FIFA's Ethics Committee has opened formal proceedings against former CONCACAF President Jeffrey Webb for his role in the football corruption scandal. Webb has pleaded guilty in the United States to offenses linked to racketeering, fraud and money laundering. He's facing a lifetime ban from all football activities. And finally, international fashion brand Chanel launched its 2017 resort collection in Havana, Cuba. The show is the first for the region and took place on Paseo del Prado. Cuba hasn't always been a destination for fashion, but things are changing. Many are flocking to the island to partake in and experience the culture before it all changes. For more on these and other stories, you can visit our website, telesurtv.net/English, or you can join us on Facebook, Instagram, and on Twitter. For more of us here at TeleSur, my name is Reagan Des Vignes. Have a good evening. Bye.